Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple minutes and let some more people join and then get us started.
We are recording today's session and we'll share the recording afterwards, especially if you want to share with any colleagues. And also if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, you can find us at Solutions Project at Uproot and Solutions Journalism Network. And we will also be having a Q&A at the end, so make sure that you're thinking of any great questions.
I think we'll just give people just a few more minutes to join and then we can kick off. But like Thelma mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end and also access to the recording of this later after the event through the Solutions Project on, I believe, their YouTube page. And I'm sure you can also find it through the Uproot project and Solutions Journalism Network as well. Well, welcome everyone again, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar that is brought to you by the Solutions Project, the Uproot Project, and the Solutions Journalism Network. We are really excited to host you all with this webinar today, and I hope that you all are excited to hear from our wonderful panelists that we have speaking today. We have Yesenia Funes, who is the climate director at Atmos, but also is a member of Uproot and a founding Uproot member. We have Thelma Young Lutanaba, who is from the Solutions Project, excuse me. And then we have Farrah Warner, who is from the Solutions Journalism Network. And as Thelma mentioned earlier, this will be recorded and there will be a Q&A after some of the discussion with the panelists. So just to kick off and get us started, Thelma, can you talk a little bit about kind of why we're here today and the trends report that the Solutions Project put out?
Definitely. And also real quick, just putting up our contact information. So if you want to contact us after this webinar, please do. I'll also share these contacts in the chat and later on, but just FYI, we would love to hear from you. But hi everyone, my name is Thelma Young Lutanaba, and I'm the Senior Communication Strategist with the Solutions Project. We just released a major new report that we're really excited to share with you, our Climate Solutions Narrative Trends Report. And this really is an amazing deep dive into the past year of media coverage, looking at renewable energy, food and water and climate solutions, and really looking at how are they talking about these climate solutions. So just a little bit about the Solutions Project. We're a national nonprofit organization that promotes climate justice through grant making. And the majority of our grantees are organizations led by BIPOC communities and women of color. We really believe that the solutions to the climate crisis are being led by frontline groups on the ground. And so we really want to support them in so many different ways to share the powerful steps that they're taking to build real lasting solutions. On top of grant making, we also do other media and narrative and digital work to amplify their stories and get their messages seen even more. We do see that we are in the moment of an imagination crisis where it's hard for people to imagine the possibilities of what could be. And so we want to make sure that people can see them and also make sure that they're seeing stories rooted in justice and equity. So we would love to, again, hear from you more if you have more questions. And this report's really key to us because we use it for our own strategy. You know, we want to understand the landscape of how people are talking about climate solutions, so that way then we can think about where are the proper, strategic interventions that we can make. And then we also really want to share this with other organizations and journalists like yourselves to help inform things as well. Our amazing research project, research partner with this project is Conspire for Good. They're amazing. They bring so much technical expertise and experience and are really so helpful in doing this amazing deep dive. And if you want to really go deep on their methodology, they would love to hear from you as well. And we're really lucky to have them as a partner. So a little bit about the history of this report, because we've been doing it for a couple of years now. We started it in 2018 because we really wanted to see where the gaps are and understand how people are talking about renewable energy. The first several years of this, we just focused on renewable energy as a climate solution. And so we wanted to see, are they talking about people? How are they talking about communities? How are they talking about issues of justice? How are they talking about communities of color? We really wanted to understand this landscape and see, what could be done to help bridge these divides. So we've been doing it since 2018, but it's just been renewable energy. And here is some of the early data, which keep in mind because then it will be really interesting to see where we are now. In 2018, only 21% of the articles quoted a woman as a spokesperson. And this was if they quoted a person at all. There's still lots of articles about renewable energy that never actually even quote a human being. And only 21% are women. And that was a really big red flag for us. And then if we go further, communities of color were only referenced in 7% of articles about renewable energy. And in 2019, it got even worse, where there was a drop, and it was communities of color were referenced in only 2% of articles about renewable energy. So pretty big. Also in 2018, only 10% of articles referenced issues of equity and justice. And in 2019, we also saw that drop to 6%. So these are single digits. And it is also really important to know that there is a difference. You know, a lot of groups do want to talk about equity and justice, but they maybe don't want to talk about racial justice, and they aren't explicit in saying we need to talk about communities of color. And so this is also why we broke it up, because we wanted to understand this divide. So things were not looking great at the start. And so this year, we wanted to expand it. And we wanted to look at not just renewable energy, but food and water solutions as well. These are also issues that affect a lot of communities, especially frontline communities. And so we wanted to see how the media was also talking about these as climate justice solutions as well. So this year we have 3 verticals: renewable energy, water, and food that we're looking at. So some of our key findings. Well, first thing, in 2021, we analyzed over 7,000 news and opinion articles. This is not broadcast, FYI, so this is just news and opinion. And we wanted to try and get a really strong sampling. So 7,000 were analyzed. We also looked at social media as well. And so we looked at 3,900 pieces of social media. And we were specifically looking at the social media posts that had the most engagement. And here's some of the things we found. We found that when a person was referenced or quoted in an article, it was more likely that that person was a woman, which is huge. We went from 20% to now that the majority of spokespeople mentioned in an article are women. Another really interesting thing that we started to see is that more and more stories that talk about climate solutions and natural disasters are doing a good job of linking the climate crisis. So 65% of articles that we reviewed that talked about natural disasters did link the cause to climate change, which was a really interesting fact that we want to go deeper on. And then across all 3 verticals in this report, the articles that mentioned communities of color were actually more likely to focus on solutions and be more positive focused, which was really, really beautiful. And we did see that, again, across all 3 verticals, 20% referenced communities of color, which is a really strong increase from what we just saw in 2019. So I'll go a bit deeper into some the specifics with each of the verticals. So with renewable energy, this was a groundbreaking year where we saw 35% of articles mention issues of equity and justice. This is, again, a huge step up, and it's really exciting to see this. What I found particularly interesting is that when we compared it with social media, so again, this is social media with the highest engagement, only 9% of social media posts referred to equity and justice issues. So for me, this raised a big question of, is social media landscape actually lagging behind maybe a bit of the journalism media landscape? So that was really interesting to me. Renewable energy, again, we saw 20% of articles about renewable energy mentioned communities of color. And 67% of energy stories were positive or solutions focused, which was another record high. So when people are talking about renewable energy, it's not just talking about the problems and all the bad things happen, but they're positive and hopeful and talking about the momentum and the solutions that exist out there. Another key thing that we saw is this year's weather emergencies drove a lot of the messaging, and especially from government spokespeople who really talked about how clean energy was reliable and safe. And so that's huge, as we're seeing it become a part of the conversation more around disasters. With water, so things were actually not looking as great in the water landscape. The coverage of water issues was the least likely to be positive or solutions focused in comparison with food and renewable energy. So, for example, in 300 instances, an article's author did not even talk about a solution, just talked about kind of the problem and didn't talk about what are the possibilities. Water also had the lowest numbers for those who reference issues of equity and justice, compared again with renewable energy and food. And again, we saw this big step up in the presence of federal spokespeople. So with a lot of water issues in the US, people, think of Flint, Michigan and the incredible community organizing that happened there. But it really was the federal spokespeople who got a lot of attention and media attention when it came to water issues. With food systems, just two really interesting stats. 34.4% mentioned equity and justice when they were talking about food systems and food solutions. So that was really interesting because that was on par with renewable energy, essentially. And so we're seeing a lot of groups talking about that more. And again, this balance of kind of government and movement. Of the 844 articles that talked about government as a leader in food system solutions, 27% acknowledged the work of movements to also push for policy change. So again, we're seeing this interesting dynamic. And I just also want to say there's so much research that is in this report. And after I finish, I'll drop a link in the chat so everyone can access it and download it if you haven't already. There's so much data in there. If you want to see which media outlets are doing the best about coverage around climate solutions, within each vertical, we have data on that. If you want to get more into about who the top spokespeople, we have data on that. There's so much data, but these were just some of the key findings that I definitely wanted to highlight this year. So we are seeing a lot of really positive momentum happening. And these are just some possible opportunities and next steps that we're really thinking about. And how, whether you're a journalist, an organization, or just any kind of climate communicator, some things to think about. We're definitely seeing climate emergencies taking more and more precedence. And unfortunately, we're not tying into the solutions in with the crisis. So folks go in, they report on the crisis, and then they leave. But how can that just be a starting point? How can we also lift up the long-term and the immediate solutions that the groups on the ground are building? And this is really important because there is so much innovation that actually comes in the moment of disaster. And so this is also a really important thing that we think more journalists should highlight. And I also want to give a shout out to Rachel Ramirez, who's also part of Uproot and works at CNN. And if you want a great example of someone who does this well, look at Rachel's work. Another thing we think should be encouraged is to focus more on movement leaders and less on partisan fights. There is, as we all know, things are bad in the federal government between the parties, and it is taking up a lot of space, which makes sense. And we also need to not forget the power and the amazing work that the communities are already doing. Despite what's going on in Washington, communities on the ground are doing work. So we need to make sure that they get attention too. And not just have it be about, who's fighting with whom. Another thing that came up is we need to be better about sharing the vision of water solutions. We saw that with renewable energy and food, there was a lot of positive solutions-focused stories. So people could see, okay, here's not just the problem of what we can do, but there was a lack of that with water. So I think we need to be better about showcasing of what are the solutions when it comes to water and how we can be better. And then last thing, this is really important, especially after the Supreme Court ruling today. If federal power is going to be limited, we cannot forget the power of local and state fights. And so many cities and states and counties. The fight is raging and groups are doing amazing, amazing work. So we want to make sure that this is not forgotten, and that whether you're a national or local reporter, that you're thinking also about, what are the fights happening just around you. So there's lots more I could say. And if you want to hear more about this report, or if you want to interview and some of our amazing grantees who are all grassroots climate justice leaders in and of themselves, you can always contact me, Thelma at thesolutionsproject.org, and we're happy to build any more connections with any of our grantees on the ground. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview and diving a little bit deeper into the report. It seems like such an amazing resource. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on how things have shifted in the Biden era.
Yeah, and that's been something that's been really interesting to see. We've definitely seen that the Biden administration's been trying to move things federally, both with Build Back Better, Justice 40, and other initiatives. So they are taking a stronger stance, which also means that they're doing a lot more press and media around this. Before, in the past, the main messengers were people in industry, local movements, tech companies, things like that. And now we're seeing the major spokespeople are actually from the federal government. People like Secretary Haaland, AOC, and many others, they're the ones who are actually becoming some of the big spokespeople on climate solutions, which is on one hand super exciting. And I know a tactic that a lot of groups have been leaning into is how to build up more top level spokespeople. And at the same time, we also, again, need to not forget state and local and movement leaders as well. And then another question that kind of came up through this year's report is, how do we view bipartisanship? It can be easy to say that, if a climate solution is bipartisan, that is a positive thing, because that means that people are agreeing, it's being moved forward. But actually, does it mean that it's being weakened? And isn't this the strong solution that we need? So we're starting to think about bipartisanship and what that means for climate solutions. And so, yeah, we're definitely seeing things change in the Biden era with the federal government really stepping up. But now it's going to be really interesting to see in the coming year what that looks like and what happens. So we'll be tracking that again this year.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's definitely something, especially with the rulings today, that will always be top of mind for us. I would love to jump to Yesenia to ask you kind of a two-part question around this. And I was wondering if we can talk about how you bring storytelling into your work, and then also how has the Uproot project allowed you and other journalists to pursue this work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucia and Thelma, for organizing this, and really glad to be on this panel with you all. It feels really fitting that we're talking about this today, because I think that for many of us, the idea of solutions just feels so impossible, I think, right now. But I think it's important for us, especially as journalists, to sort of navigate and work through some of those emotions and allow those emotions to guide our storytelling as well. In my work as climate director of Atmos, which is an independent nonprofit magazine, we launched about 3 years ago now. So for those who aren't familiar, our whole ethos is really around heart-centered, emotional storytelling, community-centered storytelling. And for us, it's important that our stories are driven by what we're feeling, right? By what the people we're talking to are feeling, by the lived experiences of our sources, the expertise of our sources. And so it's hard sometimes when things feel a little rough, but it's also a moment for us to reflect, right, on the importance of showcasing solutions and showcasing and platforming the optimism, the necessary optimism, right, that many communities have. For many communities, doomism isn't an option, right? They can't afford to give in and accept, what many climate doomists like to argue that, we're screwed. And in fact, there's incredible mobilizations happening on the local level. And I really appreciate that, Thelma, what you mentioned about the importance of state level work, local work, and also international, what's happening outside of the US. Atmos is an international publication. And so a lot of our stories look beyond the US, beyond Europe. What are some of our, peers in Latin America, in African nations, in Asia? What are folks doing abroad that can also serve as inspiration, and also serve as effective models for us to look at here in the US? And I think that that's something that we're seeing a little bit more of within the climate media landscape, which is really exciting, especially through that solutions lens. But also, it's important when reporting on solutions to also have a solid foundation and laying out to your readers what the issues are, right? And so I think there's a lot more success in terms of reporting on international issues within climate change, and also showing those solutions forward. Thinking, right now about what's happening, for instance, in across India and Bangladesh with the heat wave that's been ongoing, and the way that that was being covered in the beginning, and the way it's not being covered so much now. I find myself wondering, what are the solutions, right, to these sort of extreme events that grasp an entire region? I don't know the answer to that, right? But I think those are the sort of questions that we as journalists need to ask ourselves, because there have to be people on the ground who are figuring out how to survive and make it through these sorts of extreme events. And it's important for us to reach out and establish what that may be. But it's funny that we're talking about this now, because I remember when I first became a journalist back, 2014, my first job was at Yes Magazine, which is a solutions focused national publication. And back then, there weren't many media outlets looking at community organizing or activism or the voices of the marginalized in a way that centered them, and in a way that uplifted them as solutions. It was oftentimes, when those voices were included in the stories, it was very like, oh no, look at these poor people, versus like, look at the power of these people. And I think that since then, since 2014, it's been really, really inspiring to see, I think, the approach that journalists are taking in their work. And I do think a lot of that has to do with, the increasing diversity of the field, and which is why I think that the Uproot Project is just such a critical institution and organization here, because it's key to have journalists of color in newsrooms pushing for stories that cover their communities, that uplift the voices from their communities, and tackles the issue of climate change through a lens that isn't just fatalistic, that is real, and that does clearly lay out the severity of the issue here, but that also shows what folks are doing on the ground, the policies that are working, the policies that are failing, the organizations that are doing the work, the intersectionality of this work. And I think that's something that's been quite impressive to see, is the intersectional approach that many folks are taking to their reporting, understanding that climate change solutions aren't just about policies that reduce emissions, but that these solutions are also about policies that improve the health of communities, that provide people a living wage, all these different approaches that I think people are finally bringing into their reporting. That being said, I think there's still so much more that we need to do here, which is why groups like the Solutions Journalism Project and Uproot are so essential, so that we can keep bringing this narrative forward, and revolutionizing, I think, the way that we tell stories in the climate landscape. Really excited for projects like Grist's Fixed Solutions Lab, which has this cool Cli-Fi contest, sort of like imagining what the world can look like. And I think that that radical imagination is what's really, really needed in this moment, and really, really needed in the storytelling work that journalists are doing. We're reporters and we're here to do work on the news, but we're also storytellers, and we're also rabble rousers and heart movers. And I think that we need to sort of reposition the way we think of ourselves in that sense, given the urgency of the movement, and the inspiration that the public really needs from us. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure Farah will have even more to add on this point.
Thank you so much, Yesenia, for the insight on the evolution of solutions-based journalism and why it is so important, and especially including diverse voices in storytelling and in the climate narrative. But I imagine it's not just important to have those voices, but it's important to make sure those voices reach a wide amount of people and are amplified. So Farah, I would love to turn to you and talk a little bit about what and how the Solutions Journalism Network amplifies journalists' work in general, but specifically during this shift that we were talking about with Thelma.
Great. Thank you, Lucia and Yesenia and Thelma. It's great to be here. So the way that, and I'm going to share my screen in just a minute, but I wanted to answer your question is, one of the ways, we have a number of ways that we amplify and distribute the work of journalists and newsrooms that work with us through our story tracker, which can be found on solutionsjournalism.org. We also have the Sojo Exchange, which is a republication opportunity. So you can take stories from there, you can upload stories and republish them through Creative Commons. And then we also have climate collections that we are building and have built that really let people understand the vast amount of climate solution stories that are out there. So that's an answer to the specific question, but I'm going to share my screen just so I can give you guys a bit of a sense of what we do at Solutions Journalism Network. Importantly, also how we think about a couple of threads that I heard from both Thelma and Yesenia. Today could be seen as a tough day, right? Another tough day in a series of tough days with the Supreme Court decision coming down concerning the EPA. But what we saw with Thelma's presentation is the media is shifting the climate narrative. We're starting to see that happen, and it's really important for us, and it's one of the things that we do at Solutions Journalism Network, is to continue to keep up that pressure and that intensity around covering responses to climate issues and climate problems, and not just staying in the space of sort of doom and gloom. And Yesenia, I think you also really, focused on, sometimes it's really hard to find the responses when so much of what we're hearing from the media is doom and gloom, but so much of the reason for that is because we do have lots of problems, lots of issues happening around the world. But for us at Solutions Journalism Network, we're really focused on changing the climate narrative. I like to say that we need to move our climate coverage from unsolvable and apocalyptic to rigorous evidence-based journalism that importantly catalyzes communities to take action. So we need both things to happen. And importantly, Yesenia, you pointed this out, there are a lot of solutions and responses that are happening within communities of color that need to be amplified and distributed to be able to show others what is possible, either in mitigation or adaptation or resilience to climate change. And we shouldn't actually have to be resilient to climate change. We should have started all of this a long time ago, but we are where we are. But we do need to amplify and raise up those stories. So the question is like, how do we even do this? We're very good in the media at covering the problem. Our traditional theory of change is to be the watchdog. Let's point the problem out, and then we leave it. And we hope that somewhere along the way, somebody's going to come along and do something. But we oftentimes don't come back to those stories. So for us at Solutions Journalism, there is a way to make this shift. from unsolvable to apocalyptic. So we have a solutions journalism framework, and this is a very short version of it. We do trainings around this all the time, so feel free to email me if you're interested in this. But the solutions framework is built around 4 pillars. What is the response to the problem? What's the evidence of effectiveness? Not success, but how effective was it? What were the insights that we could learn from this story, this broadcast, this podcast, this digital site that would help us do the same thing in our community? And importantly, what are the limitations to that response? There are no silver bullets. There never are going to be silver bullets. And there are going to be millions, if not billions, of responses to the climate crisis that we're in. I'm going to dig just a little bit deeper. So when we say covering a response to a problem, we're really focused on what is that response to a problem that is notably for those most affected by both of those things, and really dig into how it happened. As I said, we're looking for evidence of impact and effectiveness, just not good intentions. We have a lot of good intentions out there in the world. We have a lot of promises and a lot of pledges. We need to move beyond promises and pledges, because that's where we often focus our sort of good news, is the promise and the pledge. And we need to keep coming back to those promises and pledges and say, hold people accountable. Did you do the work? Did it happen? We also need to really produce these insights. We have to help people respond, because that's what I think is missing in the news, is giving people an opportunity to have access to news and information that helps them build a more equitable and sustainable world. We have to help people respond. And importantly, I would say limitations are at the heart of any solutions journalism story that you do. You always have to point it out, because importantly, it keeps us away from greenwashing, woke washing, purpose watching, virtue signaling, whatever, however you want to call it. And importantly, failure and talking about failure can teach us how to do better next time. There's a story that quotes that I just read this morning about fast fashion, and how H&M had been really focused on this Higgs index that would tell you whether the piece of clothing that you're wearing was sustainable. And H&M was using that Higgs index completely wrong in some instances. Now, the Higgs index may have been an amazing, really good response, but it had so many limitations and so many problems with it. So it's actually a really strong failure story, or what we like to call an instructive failure. And here's the reason that we think this approach, this solutions journalism approach, is so important to climate change. Pew Research shows us that a vast majority of people in 17 countries are very concerned or somewhat concerned about climate change and how it's going to affect them personally. And at least at this point in time, it was at some point in the future. I'm going to change this slide that say at some point now, because we're all being affected by climate. But the problem is people are concerned about it. Our audiences and communities care, but our news coverage is so deactivating. So this was research done after the IPCC report in 2020. 79% of the headlines that they looked at on 25 of the most linked to news sites evoked fear and hopelessness. What is that really going to do to people? You just scared them. You made them feel hopeless. And we know from the most recent Reuters report on journalism is that people are just literally turning us off. They're not even reading us or consuming us anymore. That's a problem. And so that's why solutions journalism and other ways of doing journalism that catalyze communities is really important. And the final thing that I'll say before we move on to some questions in a couple more slides is, we have Solutions Journalism Network, but we didn't create solutions journalism. Solutions journalism has been being practiced for decades within communities and community newspapers and community news organizations across the world and across the United States. All we've done is said there are some ways of doing this, and we can help you through that framework. So I was on honor the work that's been done long before we were ever founded in 2013. And the last thing I'm going to sort of say, and I just added this slide because of something you said, Yesenia, we need to stop doing this. Because if we keep writing the same depressing story over and over again, not only are we turning off our audiences and our communities, but we're doing a lot of harm to ourselves. And that is not to say that we shouldn't cover the problems. We have to. But there is hope, which we like to call hope with teeth at Solutions Journalism Network, that can really lead us to a place of particularly looking at communities that really are doing great work and really are effectively working toward solutions and responses to climate. I'm going to close here. As I said, we have climate collections available at solutionsjournalism.org. They're a great way to find stories or even just be inspired or find ideas. And then we have the Solutions Journalism Exchange where you can republish work. And you can also connect with us for any training or honestly, just if you just want to talk about any of this. And this is my last slide. Feel free to follow us on Twitter. And that's my email address, so you can feel free to contact me there. So I'm going to stop sharing now and come back. So I'll turn it back over to you, Usha. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah, for that overview of Solutions Journalism Network, and the work that you guys do is so important, especially to communities like the Uproot Project, amplifying our voices and climate reporting. I would love to take some time to ask a few questions to all three of you, because I would love to hear the different perspectives in your answers. And I was wondering if you all, and feel free to just jump in, could touch a little bit on how you see solutions-based journalism changing based on the shifts that are already happening, the shifts that Thelma touched on, and the evolution of solutions-based journalism that Yesenia also touched on while she was speaking. Thelma, why don't you kick us off and we can go from there.
Well, I mean, there's a reason we title this webinar Hope and Justice, because we are seeing like more momentum and more energy happening with this. And so that's really exciting for me. And that's also what the report is showing me. I'm also really hopeful that we'll see changes, not just in the field of journalism, but in the cultural sphere as well. I want to give a shout out to the Climate Storytelling Playbook that was put out by Good Energy, which is a guidebook for screenwriters who want to do better, film and TV that talks about climate change. So I'm hopeful that that we'll see momentum in the media landscape, in our cultural storytelling, and also what Yesenia said, like we need more storytellers. We need a better diversity of storytellers, and that is 1,000% true. So I'm hoping that we can see a lot more people recognize that to tell a climate story is not about a scientist. It can be about such an amazing diversity of things.
Yeah, I really love that what you said, Thelma, about culture, because I think that for a long time, climate reporting has sort of like lived outside of culture reporting. And at most, our whole thing is climate and culture, trying to make sure that we're making clear to folks that climate is not only going to impact our culture, and culture can mean very many things, right, depending on your background and where you live, but also our culture must change in order to step up to the reality of the climate crisis. And I think one trend actually that's been really encouraging for me, I think for a long time there was this really like strict narrative of like, you need to do this to solve climate change. Like you need to solve climate change, like very individualistic, but in a way that was, I don't know what the word is, but like pushy and antagonistic, it didn't really foster, I think, excitement over people getting involved in climate work, or even trying to readjust their lifestyles or culture to address, their emissions. And then we saw a pivot to, I think, this like, sort of, it's not on us at all. It's on the corporations who are causing this. And I mean, I will admit, I was even someone who was sort of like writing with that narrative at one point of like, it shouldn't be on individuals. This is a systemic issue. And I think that we're finding a balance now in many stories, at least that I'm reading, where it's clear that systemic change is necessary to address the severity of the climate crisis, right? We need to see private companies and governments take action to reduce emissions. But we're also seeing these stories being told in a way that's like, but here's what you can do as well alongside that. And here's individual actions you can do to actually push policy in this direction. I remember Dr. Catherine Wilkinson, who is a writer and advocate, published this really powerful piece in Time, I think it was last year or the year before, giving readers a sort of like guide into how they can take action. And it wasn't the sort of action that I think media used to tell people to do, like start recycling, don't drive your car. It was more focused on building community, being an engaged citizen, getting active in terms of being involved with your like CSA or your farmers market, stuff like that, that I think is much more powerful than all these little individualistic actions that we can do. And I find that really encouraging, that I think folks in this space are becoming much more literate and sophisticated in helping readers navigate what they can do to tackle the crisis in a way that goes beyond their household, but that can sort of like spread change and really have potential to transform our culture, which I think is a big part of the narrative that isn't coming through, I think, at the volume we needed to. And that's a trend that for me is just really, really encouraging. I'm really, really glad that we get to do some of that at Atmos, and hope that more and more outlets are going to be doing this kind of coverage as well.
Yeah, I'd love to follow on with what Yesenia said, because I think it's so critical that in the media, we help our audiences and our communities understand how they, what I call, bolt into that systems change. It's like because you can be greater than the sum, like it's greater, the sum is greater than its parts. I think I'm using that right. And it isn't an individual action that may only take you so far, and that's why recycling is such a sort of question mark right now, because we're not sure, and I think we're pretty sure that it really doesn't do all that much. Rejecting plastic, and working toward activism and policy around the fossil fuel industry building cracker plants so that all they do is actually create the stuff that's going to make more plastic. I think that kind of bolting between systems and individuals is really critical, and I think that's where the media can make a lot of difference. The other thing I really liked seeing, Thelma, in the media narrative study was the link between extreme weather events and climate. And I think that's so important that that is finally starting to happen, because too often we will have, news media talking about a client, an event like a wildfire or a tornado or hurricane, and not making that connection. And I think what's been really good is you're starting to see scientists being out there to help the news media navigate that, and to be clear that causation and correlation and understanding all of that, but still making those linkages so that people understand it.
Thank you all for answering that question. I was wondering if I think we have time for maybe one more question from me, and then if anyone in the audience also has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have time to get to those as well. But I think you all kind of touched on this in the answers that you just gave. But I was wondering if we can dive just a little bit deeper into why these shifts are important for the future of environmental journalism and, solutions-based climate journalism.
Well, I think a main thing is that if we don't give readers the types of stories that they can engage with positively, they're going to tune out, right? In the way that Farah showed through the data she brought here. And that's disastrous, right? If people stop engaging with climate news, if people start to tune out, that feeds into the doomism that I think we're seeing build among a certain cohort of people. And that's really dangerous. People need to be getting their climate news. People need to know the problems. They need to know the solutions. They need to have a really good understanding of what's happening and a really clear understanding of what to do. Otherwise, I think that feeds really the sort of like right-wing machine that is preventing climate action from happening in the first place. And I think causes a lot of disengagement with our political system, which is a big part of why climate policy doesn't happen in the first place. So I think that's one thing there. But I also think that it's important for us as journalists, you know, and I think Farah hinted at this earlier. If we're going to have folks in this field doing this work, we need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and practicing sustainability within ourselves as well. And doing those, you know, really dark gloom and doom stories are really taxing. It takes a big toll on us mentally, emotionally, physically. And I think it's important for our well-being to make sure that we're also covering stories that can nurture us and feed us. And give us hope as well, you know, because that comes through in our reporting. When reporters aren't feeling good about the state of the world, that comes through in the types of stories we choose and the way we write. Like, we are vessels for the storytelling. And so if we're not feeling good, our readers aren't going to feel good either. And that's something that I know for me, and being someone who's, you know, constantly connecting with folks on the ground and hearing from activists who sustain a really beautiful level of optimism despite living in really egregious situations. That has been very grounding for me, really humbling, and also just really motivational whenever days like today come where I start to feel like, oh no, everything's going down and, you know, things start feeling really bad. I remind myself of the folks that I speak to, and when I do speak to them, it re-energizes me. And I think that we as journalists need that in order to keep doing the work and in order to keep serving our readers and the public at large.
Yeah, I'll just I want to honor some work that a journalist does in Canada, Stefan Labe, who works for Glacier Media. And last year during the wildfires that were basically consumed one town completely, like the town just, it exploded into fire. He was doing what was so interesting to me is he was covering the breaking news of the wildfires. And then a few days later, he'd do a solution story. And then he'd cover the breaking, and then he'd cover a solution. And I haven't spoken with Stefan about this. We have a partner who works primarily with our Canadian newsrooms. But what I loved about seeing that is an approach that was not just balanced, but was doing both things. And that's not always easy for us to do, because he knew he needed to cover what was happening. This was an emergency, he needed to be there for his community, like how to get away, how to evacuate, where the fires were, all that. But he seemed to also remember that what they needed for him the next day or the next week was also sort of what were the solutions that were being created, or what could we learn from other places around wildfire. And so I think that is important for us to sort of keep in mind. I think for me, the critical thing is we can't have people turn off. It's going to take 8 billion people on the face of this earth to keep this beautiful planet a place where we can all live and we can all survive, do more than survive, where we can have sustainable, equitable lives. And I don't want our audiences to turn off. I don't want it to be rose-colored glasses either. I want it to be realistic and understanding. And this is not easy, but it's not unsolvable. We have to hold companies and governments and ourselves accountable for our actions, because when something is unacceptable, it's solvable, and that's what's important to me.
Awesome. I'll just add real quickly. Solutions Project, we're a philanthropic organization, so we are interested in issues around money and justice. So one thing that we're looking at, does increased coverage of solutions led by frontline communities then mean for them to get more donations and more money to fund their work? That's a big question. And hopefully more coverage does shift the money. And on the other hand, if frontline organizations get the funding to do more communications and storytelling work, they can better tell their story. Does that actually affect the trends that we're seeing in regards to climate solution stories? So that's something that we're looking at. But I totally agree with what Farah and Yesenia said. We need to show people what's possible. And just personally, today saw the EPA news, was so sad. And then I had a call with Blacks and Green in Chicago, and their ED Naomi walked me through some of the amazing things that they're doing to fight energy poverty. And it just reminded me, it's like, no, we're not giving up. There's so many groups who are doing amazing things who aren't stopping. And so neither should we.
Thank you all for that insight and thoughtful response to my question. I think we have time for one audience question, and anyone who has any insight to share on this, please feel free. But the question is, any insight on why media narrative around climate and water was so far behind energy and food systems? Why isn't it being covered as much?
I think that's a great question. So this is the very first year that we looked at water solutions, and that was a big flag for us. So it is something that we'll be diving into more in this upcoming year. But I think part of it is just like the solutions are not being talked about, they're not being envisioned. And so I'm not entirely sure why. And it could be because a lot of water issues are very systemic, and so maybe more messy. I don't know. But we're definitely seeing water issues being important to so many communities. So I don't know exactly why, but it's something that we saw. So it's something we want to reach into more.
Yeah, I also wonder if it has to do with just the fact of how niche like water reporting can be, and if that contributes at all to like who gets to report on those issues, and therefore the insight that they have into the solutions that exist there and like what's happening beyond whatever bubble we live in. We all live in our bubbles, and so yeah, it is a really niche beat within like the environmental beat is water. Like it's really rare that someone gets to just focus specifically on water, so I imagine that might have something to do with that there too.
Yeah, in terms of water, I don't generally like to. I mean, there is the big water and oceans conference that's happening in Lisbon right now. So there's a lot of coverage out there about not only the emergency we're having with our oceans, but I think there are also solutions. Again, I'm not always a fan of doing this, but if you haven't seen John Oliver's most recent take on water, it's definitely one because he really focuses particularly on the American West and what's happening out there. So I'm hoping that maybe more people will start taking notice of this. And I think it's important. And there was a great question that we're going to take that I wanted to highlight from Evan George. It said, what kinds of tips and pitches from organizations do you value? What kind of evidence helps make their case, and what distinguishes those from pitches and press releases that you ignore? I can take that from like a solutions journalism network approach, but Yesenia and Lucia, if you want to jump in, is I'm an old business journalist. I question everything that happens in a press release. So while I'm happy to get those pitches, what I really want is access to the raw data. I want it disaggregated. I want to be able to look at it myself and spend time with it. And importantly, I want access again to the people most affected by the solution and by the problem. So I'll leave it at that. But I'm really looking for evidence of effectiveness, and we really guard at solutions journalism in using sort of hyperbole, like this is the most successful or this is the best thing. We're always wanting to really dig into the data, particularly the quantitative data. But I know Yesenia or Lucia, if you have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I love the point you made about hyperbole, Farah, because I experienced this so much, especially with younger writers, just like how casual I think folks use hyperbole, and just how like it's not good. It's just a big red flag, I think, for me when I read that and when I see that in other reporting. And so definitely not the right approach. I think for me at Atmos, at least, you know, we're certainly not a solutions publication in the way that I think Farah describes with like the data. Data is certainly not our strong suit. So when I look at pitches, I'm really, really interested in looking at stories that can bring through emotion, stories that can trigger an emotional response from readers through human narrative, through someone's own personal lived experience. Those are really key for me. Like if I can get a story idea that's like a reported essay from someone that brings forward their lived experience through the lens of a, you know, ongoing climate issue, that to us is like one of our sweet spots. You know, I think that there's immense value though in like those data-driven stories, and that's certainly an area that I personally am trying to get the team more interested in at Atmos, because I think that that's where you can really like make a case, right, and bring a story before Congress, for instance. But I do also think that there's a lot of power in treating people's lived experience as a point of expertise, and really bringing that forward more and more, I think, in climate storytelling. So that's what I look for, at least in the pitches that I get for Atmos.
Did anyone else on our panel have anything that they wanted to share to answer that last question? Well, we are coming up on time. So I just wanted to thank all of you for attending and listening in on this conversation, and also thank all of our wonderful panelists for taking the time to come in and have this very important conversation, especially in today's climate, around climate news and solutions-based journalism and environmental journalism. Before you guys go, I just wanted to share a few resources that we have for you as well. And then also reiterate, if you want to get in contact with any of us, all of our contacts and resources are here. And then also please, on behalf of the Uproot Project, be watching the space and checking out our new website and our new database. And then Thelma and Farah or Yesenia, if there was anything you quickly wanted to highlight before we sign off here today, please go ahead.
Just want to know, I dropped my email and my handle, my Twitter handle on the chat as well.
The last thing I have to say is, Lucia, thank you so much for being our MC and playing us through that. So it's been a pleasure working with all of you.
Yeah, so much gratitude for Lucia and my fellow panelists. I felt like this was the conversation that my soul needed to have today. So, and thank you for everyone who joined. We'll be sharing the recording afterwards. And yeah, if you're interested, if you're a journalist and you're looking for connections to awesome climate justice organizations, reach out to me at the Solutions Project. And you can also find a bunch of our other reports and resources on our website.
Well, thank you all again, and I hope you have a lovely weekend as well.
Thank you all. Bye.